The computer evaluation has Magnus down 10 points at one point in this game. That's the equivalent of a queen and a pawn. It is a huge advantage. So Magnus gets himself in really big trouble here. The question is, can he get out of it? And of course, we're using some computers to help us analyze this very complex game. Magnus has the black pieces in this game. His opponent is Renato Terry, a very strong player. His his chess.com rating is over 3,000. So quite strong. This game was played on titled Tuesday. Let's begin. I am Renato begins with d4, and Magnus plays f5, or the Dutch defense, immediately seeking to gain space on the king side. The only downside is f7 is already a sensitive square for black, so this does expose black's king a little bit, and white plays bishop to g5. This is what's called an anti-Dutch move. It's sort of a sideline, but it's very commonly played. And it pins the e-pawn and invites a little trap, actually, with h6 and bishop h4, g5, bishop g3. And it looks like black is trapping the bishop after f4, the so-called Noah's Ark trap. But then white shocks black with this move, e3, attacking the pawn at f4 twice. And the pawn takes bishop, queen to h5 is checkmate. Now, Magnus avoids all of that stuff and just plays c6. Maybe he'll play d5 later. It allows the queen to develop to b6. e3, now queen to b6. In queen-pawn openings in particular, when the queen's bishop develops early, this b2 pawn becomes quite sensitive, or if it's black doing it's the b7 pawn. So Magnus immediately attacks the now undefended pawn on b2. White plays queen to c1, defending. h6 hits the bishop, bishop f4, and d6. And one of black's main strategic goals in this type of structure, like the classical Dutch or the Leningrad Dutch, is to play the move e5, gain space in the center. So we'd love to play knight d7 and e5 and gain that space if he can. White plays knight to f3, which is actually a novelty, but it's, of course, the most natural move on the board. This position just hasn't been played very much. Knight to f6, knight b to d2, continuing to develop, and g5. Magnus gains space, pushes the bishop back to g3, and immediately plays knight to h5. What Magnus obviously wants to do is to win the bishop pair as quickly as possible, but also by taking this bishop off of the board, it takes one of the pieces that white is using to control e5, and so that helps Magnus to play e5 when he can. Bishop to d3, bishop to g7, another piece is developed, and also again aiming at e5. c3, and white creates this pawn structure very familiar to London system players. It's essentially a semi-Slav pawn structure from the black opening, the semi-Slav, where white just adopts that pawn structure for himself, controlling the dark squares. Queen to c7, again aiming at e5. Queen to c2. So white attacks the f5 pawn. That was the first move Magnus played, was f5, and this pawn is vulnerable. And computers say the best move for black is to just go ahead and castle. That way the rook becomes the second defender of the pawn. But Magnus, maybe because he doesn't want to commit his king yet, goes ahead and plays e6. And this is where he sort of begins to lose the thread, and the computers begin to prefer white a little bit. And here, international master Terry plays a very strong move. A move that looks like a blunder at first sight, but is in fact a very strong idea. e4. Now, this looks like a mistake because of the move Magnus Carlsen plays in response, f4, right? Isn't it just trapping the bishop at g3? Well, it is, but the IM's response here shows that he has thought one move ahead here, e5. The threat is bishop to g6 check, picking up the knight. So he would trade this bishop for this knight, and the knight, you see, has actually no squares here at all. So he's going to recover that piece, and white is clearly better at this point. Pawn takes bishop, bishop g6 check, king to d8, bishop takes knight, Magnus takes on f2 with check, and king takes f2. So Magnus, according to the computer evaluation, is down 2.5, minus 2.5. That's almost the value of an entire minor piece, basically because of white's space. His king is stuck in the middle of the board, and you'll notice all three of these queenside minor pieces are undeveloped. So that is really the essence of the advantage that white has in this game. Uh, DE5 is played by Magnus, trying to create a target on E5, a weakness. DE5. Now knight to D7. You'll see the bishop, knight, and queen all attack the E5 pawn. Here the IM plays knight to C4, defending the pawn a second time, but it's defended twice and attacked 3 times. So Magnus goes ahead and takes the pawn, but that turns out to be risky because it opens up his king even more. And IM Terry plays a very strong move here. Rook F to D1 check. And Magnus's king is in big trouble. In fact, if he plays the move bishop d7, which is the computer's top recommendation, the computers I consult, which is Stockfish 15. In this case, white has an advantage of +5, still enormous. After king to e7, as was played in the game, white's advantage jumps to +10, a huge advantage. Again, it's like a queen and a pawn's worth of advantage. Knight ce5 is played, bishop e5 is played, and the key move white needs to play here in order to keep that huge advantage is this: queen to g6, with the immediate threat of queen to f7 mate. I mean, Magnus might have played on here, but he is in huge trouble. In fact, he's lost. If black were to, say, play rook to f8 to stop queen to f7, then queen to h7 check is winning, and after the king moves to f6, which is essentially forced, queen h6, king e7, queen to g5 check. If bishop to f6, for example, then queen to c5 check wins very quickly, and that would be checkmate. But here white, instead of queen to g6, makes a consolidating move. He plays the move king to g1, getting the king to safety, and that +10 drops down to about a 2.5 here. But white's still clearly in the driver's seat. Bishop to d7, queen to e4, attacking the bishop at e5 twice. The bishop moves to f6. And here the strongest move for white is probably knight to d4, with the idea of maybe knight to f5 check, because of the pawn is pinned. Maybe the knight can jump into d6, get on a strong square there. But white plays king to h1, and now the advantage is much smaller. Black has a playable game, still likes white a little bit better, but there's a lot of ebb and flow left. Believe me, there's a lot to happen in this game. Magnus plays queen to f4, seeking the relief of trading queens. Obviously, white doesn't want to do that. He wants to take advantage of black's centralized king, so queen to e2, rook a to d8, and here white had a very strong move, rook to f1, setting up a discovery against the queen at f4. If the queen were to, say, retreat to c7, then after rook a to e1, you can see white's pieces are perfectly positioned for attack, every piece on an ideal square. But instead he plays the rook to e1. It is the same file as the king, so that does make sense, but it is not as strong as rook to f1 as it turns out. And Magnus plays g4, hitting the knight at f3. That knight goes to d2, and then he continues with g3, trying to create some discomfort for the king at h1. Here, white could keep his advantage with a move knight to e4, and black can't take on h2. The problem is this rook f1 move, and he would just win the piece on f6. So knight to e4 would give white an advantage, but after knight to f3, the position is now equalized. So let's see what happens from here. First, bishop to c8. This does allow his king a path to safety, but more importantly, he wants to play the rook to d5, activate that rook on that square. Now rook to f1, and just rook to d5. This threatens the hanging bishop on h5, and the best move here, as it turns out, computers show us, is bishop to g6, but white plays knight to d4, which at first sight is a good instinctive move. It allows the queen to defend the bishop, the rook attacks the queen, but we can see why that didn't work when Magnus plays this move, queen to h4. Threatening mate on h2, which obviously has to be dealt with, but now the bishop is attacked twice by the queen and the rook, and white has lost a piece. So h3, queen takes h5, queen to e3. But even though Magnus now has a clear advantage, it does not remain that way. Bishop takes d4, cd4, rook to f5. And this is a strong rook, and he's got control of these light squares on d5 and f5, which are very nice pivot points for his pieces. Queen takes g3, rook h to f8. Obviously, white does not want to exchange pieces. His only chance is to put pressure on the king at e7. So rook f to e1 to avoid the exchanges. Bishop to d7. Queen to a3, check. So how does Magnus deal with this? Well, if he had played king to d8, he would have kept his current advantage because of the extra piece. The best move, computers show us, was actually this very strong idea, c5. And after pawn takes, bishop c6, white's own pawn blocks the queen's access to the king, and this bishop at c6 is roaring down the diagonal. White would be totally lost. But Magnus doesn't play either move. He plays the move king to f7. And this gives white a chance to get the advantage back. Can you see the move Terry could have played here to get the advantage against Magnus? That's right. g4, the pawn fork of the queen and the rook. And this queen at a3 actually defends the h3 pawn. So there's no queen takes h3 check here. So he would be winning material in this case after queen h4 pawn takes. There's still some chess to be played, but in this position, white does have a clear advantage, maybe around +4. So that was a good opportunity to get back into the game after Magnus plays king to f7. But instead he plays queen takes a7. And now Magnus is able to consolidate a bit. King to g7, queen takes b7, threatens the bishop, so rook 8, f7 to defend. Queen to c7, perhaps the queen needs to get back to do some defending. Rook to f2, attacking b2, putting pressure on g2. Queen to g3 check, but now queen to g5 for Magnus. And with the x-ray pressure on g2, Magnus is in very, very good shape now. Rook to e3, and after rook takes b2, in this position, with queens coming off, the extra pawn, and black's rook's ready to go to the 7th rank, white resigned this very dramatic game. And I tell you, it's a lesson when players this strong have this kind of back and forth in the computer evaluation. It lets us know that if one of our opponents seems to be having no mistakes in their evaluation, maybe we should be a little bit suspicious. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the game. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.